Dan, you can get started.
Good morning and welcome to a webinar sponsored by the Mohsin and Fawzia Jaffer Center for Muslim World Studies, the Plight Program for Human Rights and Diplomacy, and the Holocaust and Genocide Studies Program. The event is a panel discussion on the plight of the Rohingya, an assessment of a 21st century genocide. Today, we'll be discussing the Rohingya, an ethnic Muslim minority group in Myanmar who have for years been subjected to institutional discrimination and exclusionary citizenship laws by the government of Myanmar. In 2017, a military campaign forced hundreds of thousands of Rohingya to flee, many of them setting in Bangladesh. Since then, international human rights groups have launched a massive campaign to force an investigation into atrocities committed by the Myanmar government, including accusations of genocide. In 2019, the International Criminal Court, ICC, announced it would investigate claims into possible crimes against humanity perpetrated against the Rohingya ethnic minority. This panel will explore the current state of the Rohingya people and provide an overview of the crisis, the role of religious conflict, the dynamics of ethnic cleansing in Myanmar, including the impact of recent military coup, the politics of resettlement of refugees in Bangladesh and the region, and the role of international law and NGOs. I'm very proud to present the panelists: John G. Oates, Associate Professor, Department of Politics and International Relations at FIU; Naveen Murshid, Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of International Relations Program from Colgate University; Grisel Delena, Adjunct Professor of the Department of Religious Studies at FIU; and Mir Hussain, CEO, Bangladesh American Society of Muslim Aid for Humanity and BASMA. I am Daniel Alvarez, Senior Instructor in the Department of Religious Studies. Before we proceed with the panelists, I would like to thank also not only the Mohsin and Fawzia Center for Muslim World Studies, but of course, as I mentioned at the outset, the Václav Havel program for co-sponsoring this event, and the Holocaust and Genocide Centers, and the Dorothea Green Lecture Series, and all of our co-sponsors. It is a pleasure to have all of you sponsor us in this event today. To put the issues in context, I will ask my colleague, Grisel Delena, to speak about the plight of the Rohingya and set the context for the rest of the panel. Go ahead, Grisel.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be surrounded by so many incredible scholars, even if it's virtually. My name is Grisel Delena, and I will provide an overview of the Rohingya crisis in Myanmar, its history, and the roles that the military, Buddhist terrorist 969 movement, and Aung San Suu Kyi play in this conflict. So, in Myanmar, the military and Buddhist nationalists categorize the Rohingya as immutably foreign and Muslim. That is, they're labeled with an identity convenient to state Sangha oppression. The erosion of empathy begins with the detachment of the human from the humane. So in order to justify and carry out these war crimes, the violent state-sponsored agendas that dehumanize those who do not fit into the idealistic society imagined by the Myanmar government, they have to detach themselves from viewing them as human beings. In the case of the Rohingya, the inhumane action against them by the government is cloaked in a moral Buddhist high ground, in false narratives about the Rohingya, in fear of an unjustified idea of a potential Muslim majority in Myanmar, even though it's about a 2%, well, it was a 2% before the crisis, and by inciting violence against the Rohingya by military and groups like the 969 movement. Distribution of false narratives and the denial of the heinous crimes that have been committed in efforts to extinguish Rohingya villages and their people erodes the stories of the Rohingyas' retelling of the actual reality. There are hundreds of Rohingya testimonies retelling stories of the military, and trigger warning, burning children and fathers alive and raping mothers in front of their children. The Rohingya are the primary devotees of Islam in Myanmar, practicing a conservative form of Sunni Islam. In the past, mosques were abundant in Rohingya settlements. However, the government issued a ban on gatherings of 4 or more in 2012. This specifically targeted the Rohingya and prevented them from gathering in groups for prayer. This crisis isn't new, though. According to refugee interviews, the notable Rohingya community disturbances occurred in 1977, 1982, 1991, 2012, and 2017. In 1977, it was Operation Nagamin, which is also known as King Dragon. Sorry, my cat wants to make an appearance and she needs to calm down. During King Dragon, it occurred when they were alleging the Rohingya were illegal immigrants, rapists, and murderers of Buddhist locals. None of this was justified with empirical evidence. And following King Dragon, former Burmese leader Ne Win initiated the 1982 Burma Citizenship Act, which is fundamental to this entire case. The law claimed that there were 135 ethnic minorities within Myanmar, excluding the Rohingya. So because the Rohingya did not have adequate documentation to prove their residence prior to the year 1823, they were labeled as illegal immigrants, even though they were born in Myanmar. So Ne Win chose 1823 specifically to drive out anyone whose family had migrated during the First Anglo-Burman War in 1824. However, there's evidence of this. In 1799, Francis Buchanan, a surgeon from the British East India Company, documented that he met a group of Arakan settlers who called themselves Rohingya, or natives of Arakan. Right. So obviously, this is a British gentleman who is trying to make sense of what he is finding with locals. Right. So he called them Rohingya, but that's close enough. While observing the natives and deciphering the dialects of their language, he referred to them as Mohammedans, who were Burma Empire natives derived from the Hindu nation. Right. So in 2015, I conducted interviews with Uwashin Wiratu, who is the leader of the 969 movement. And when I brought up this evidence of the Rohingya's presence in Myanmar, he looked at me in the eyes and he simply said that the source was false, despite me having a copy of the 1799 publication on hand. He claimed that their support for Muslims is for the defense of the Sasana, which is the teachings of the Buddha, and he was disregarding the detrimental effects of their actions upon the victims of their violence. The value of the Rohingya lives were not addressed, and instead I was met with religious discourse to support their actions. The dehumanization of the Rohingya, though, is also veiled in diplomacy. Aung San Suu Kyi, the leader of the National League for Democracy, was the recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize during her 15-year house arrest for her role in undermining the military junta in Myanmar. In 2019, she traveled to The Hague to speak on Myanmar's behalf at the International Criminal Court of Justice hearings in the case concerning the application of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, the Gambia v. Myanmar. Suu Kyi was presented with accounts of Rohingya executions, infants flung to their deaths, mass rapes, and villages set ablaze. Her response to those accusations was, and I quote, "Genocidal intent cannot be the only hypothesis," end quote. There was no denying or confirming the incidents presented, and furthermore, she never once referred to the Rohingya by their name, as it would imply the group's legitimacy. And as an ethnic minority in Myanmar. So Suu Kyi also stated that the ICG case against Myanmar was precariously dependent on statements by refugees in camps in Bangladesh, who she alleged, quote, may have provided inaccurate or exaggerated information. Once again, Rohingya Agency was invalidated as an ethnic group and victims of violence. Empirical evidence of the crimes committed against them is dismissed as a mere allegation. Their identity is absent outside of their voices through this institutional betrayal. In this case, the institution is Myanmar, the government, and the military. Despite being the democratic voice of Myanmar and a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, Suu Kyi would not sacrifice her reputation and position of power to acknowledge the Rohingya as a people. However, on February 1st, 2021, she was once again imprisoned by the same government that she defended against the Rohingya in the International Court of Justice. As non-state actors, the Rohingya are othered by their own polity and do not fit into the political discourse among members of the international community. The stateless differ from the refugees insofar that they have no extensive system or international law to protect them. In most cases, the Rohingya are in a constant cycle of stateless, refugee, or asylum seekers who later become stateless elsewhere. The only way to resolve this is for the polity that denies the Rohingya basic human rights and citizenship to produce a just membership for the Rohingya through a repatriation plan. This is unlikely, and in the current state of violence and due to the coup, it is not desirable nor safe for most of the refugees interviewed. I'm going to go ahead and pass it now to Dr. Oates.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. It's great to be here to talk about this really important topic. My comments today are going to focus on the international response, so looking in particular at international organizations and international law. So the crisis in Myanmar has implicated a host of IOs, from the UN to the ICJ, as Grisel mentioned, and I'll talk a bit about that case too, to the ASEAN and others. And it involves a lot of different areas of international law, from the laws governing genocide and ethnic cleansing to international refugee law. So I'm going to provide an overview of some of these relationships with a particular focus on the role of IOs. And I'm going to focus the first part of my comments on the role of the UN in Myanmar, but I'll also discuss some of the recent international legal efforts to hold the Myanmar government accountable for its atrocities. So the UN has had a presence in Myanmar since the 1950s, and for many years that presence has been focused on the delivery of development assistance. It established a country program there in 2013, partly in response to the political reforms the country was then undergoing. And there were 18 UN agencies operating in the country when the events of this most recent crisis occurred. Being aware of that longstanding presence of the UN in Myanmar, much of which has been focused on development and political reform, is important for making sense of the often contradictory UN response to the crisis. On the one hand, UN agencies focused on development and political reform, primarily the UN Development Program and the resident coordinator, which oversees these development agencies in Myanmar. They adopted an approach which avoided public denunciation of the government's actions and instead tried to influence the government's priorities through engagement in discussion. The 2019 UN Development Program annual report on Myanmar, for example, offers only a brief mention of the crisis in the Rakhine state, and all of that is framed in terms of domestic instability rather than in terms of government violations of human rights. So this muted approach to the crisis reflects the structural factors which the UNDP and its associated agencies confront in Myanmar. In order for these UN agencies to carry out their mandates, they rely on the government to give them access to various areas within the country, to provide visas to their employees, and more broadly, to allow them to carry out their advisory and assistance programs. So an approach that's openly critical of the regime could result in a loss of access. So these agencies have decided to work with the regime rather than against it. An alternative approach to the crisis is represented by UN agencies focused on human rights and humanitarian assistance. So this would include the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the Office of the Commissioner for Humanitarian Assistance, and UN Human Rights Special Envoys. So these agencies are more vocal in their calls for international action and for accountability. In 2017, the UN Human Rights Council, which is an intergovernmental body of the UN, established a fact-finding mission which found evidence of crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, and war crimes. This then led the Human Rights Council to create in 2018 the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar. And the job of this body is to collect evidence of serious crimes and prepare files for prosecution, though that body itself is not a court. The UN Special Envoy to Myanmar, Christine Schreiner-Bergin, and the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation on human rights in Myanmar, which is former US Congressman from Maine, Tom Andrews, have also played an important role in publicizing the atrocities and human rights violations against the Rohingya. So the UN response to the crisis in Myanmar has been inconsistent and at times even incoherent, where you have these two different approaches often coming into conflict with each other. So the ambivalence we observe within what's called sometimes the second UN of UN agencies and departments is also reflected in the first UN, the intergovernmental bodies like the General Assembly and the Security Council, where the member states are represented. The Security Council of the UN has shown varying levels of interest in the plight of the Rohingya. It has been on the Security Council agenda every year since 2006, but it has so far avoided a robust response, mainly due to the unwillingness of China to pursue that route. Both China and Russia have frequently objected to any effort to intrude upon what they take to be an internal matter for Myanmar. No Security Council resolutions related to either the Rohingya crisis or the recent coup have been adopted. The only one that was proposed in 2007 was vetoed by both Russia and China. The Council hasn't been totally silent, though. It has issued what are called presidential statements, which are non-binding, and they're adopted by consensus. It did this in 2007, 2008, 2017, and then last month, it issued one of these statements as well. And this most recent statement condemns the violence against those protesting the recent coup, calls for ensuring access of humanitarian aid, and expresses concern for the safe return of Rohingya refugees. But the Security Council response is notable for what it has lacked. There has been no UN observer mission sent to the area, no resolutions adopted because of the resistance by China and Russia, and all of that strikes me as far from a robust response to the ongoing crisis. The UN General Assembly has been more vocal in its criticisms of the treatment of the Rohingya, adopting resolutions nearly every year, the most recent of which strongly condemns the violence against the Rohingya Muslims and other minorities, and calls for the safe repatriation of refugees and unhindered access to humanitarian assistance. The General Assembly is limited, though, in its authority, and unlike the Security Council, cannot authorize any enforcement actions or sanctions against Myanmar. I want to turn now to, there are other organizations we could discuss. ASEAN and the Organization of Islamic Countries have been important in this crisis as well, but I want to, in the interest of time, turn to three recent developments in areas of international law that are significant. And Grizel has mentioned one of them. This is the case brought to the International Court of Justice by Gambia against Myanmar on November 11th, 2019. And Gambia alleged that Myanmar was in violation of the Genocide Convention. And I can say a bit more in the Q&A if you'd like about why it was Gambia that brought this case. Both countries have ratified the convention, and the ICJ is delegated as the authority to resolve disputes about noncompliance, which is why it has jurisdiction here. The ICJ issued an order on provisional measures on January 23rd, 2020, calling on Myanmar to cease any ongoing acts of genocide, preserve any evidence related to the crime of genocide, and to submit a report every 6 months to the ICJ dealing with its compliance with the order, detailing its compliance with the order. It will likely take many years for this case to be completed, but the provisional measures are important, and they create another layer of international legal accountability. Now, robust enforcement of those measures and the final judgment are subject to the will of the Security Council to actually enforce it. But the order did recognize the Rohingya as a protected group as defined in the Genocide Convention, and that's an argument that the Myanmar government has repeatedly rejected. So the second significant international legal development is the investigation by the International Criminal Court into the situation in Myanmar, which was approved by the pretrial chamber on November 14th, 2019, so 3 days after the ICJ case was filed. Now, Myanmar is not a party to the Rome Statute, but the judges concluded that because part of the crime of deportation was completed in the territory of Bangladesh, which is a member, the ICC has jurisdiction in this case. So this also will take a long time for this case to be completed. Formal charges might not even be filed for years. They're still at the investigation stage, but the ICC is arguably a more robust tool for international legal accountability than the ICJ. The ICC, unlike the ICJ, brings cases against specific individuals rather than states or governments, but it can't try individuals in absentia, and it has no means on its own of apprehending indicted individuals. So again, it's going to have to rely heavily on state cooperation in order to fulfill its mandate. So the third and final development concerns a case filed in Argentina on November 13th, 2019. You can see this is the day before the ICC approval of the pretrial chamber case went forward. So it was a busy week for international law. And this is filed by a group of human rights organizations against Myanmar's officials under Argentina's Universal Jurisdiction Clause. Universal jurisdiction is a controversial principle which allows any state to hold anyone accountable for serious human rights abuses. Argentina's appeals court upheld the case, though the country currently doesn't permit trials in absentia. So unless the accused is taken into custody, the case may not be resolved. So there are a lot of other actors and efforts involved here, but I want to conclude by just discussing two dynamics that we can observe here. First, we see a split within and across IOs between those who want to take a more critical approach to dealing with Myanmar and those who take a less confrontational approach. The recent coup may have shifted the balance in these approaches towards the former, the more confrontational approach. And it'll be interesting to see how this develops in the next few months and the rest of the year. Second, it reveals the different tempos at which IOs in international law operate. IOs are pressed to respond quickly and robustly to humanitarian emergencies. And this demand for quick action often generates those tensions I mentioned between confrontation and accommodation. International law, on the other hand, almost never moves quickly, but this slower pace enables it to sidestep some of the tensions that plague IOs and allow it to focus on pursuing international legal accountability. But accountability years after the fact does little to alleviate the suffering of people today. So ultimately, we need both approaches to deal more effectively with this crisis. Given the events of the recent coup, I think there's going to be a lot of developments in the next few months on this point. So thank you very much. Dan, I'll hand it back to you. I'm not sure who's next
I think I'm next. I can just go ahead if that's all right. Hello, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Muhyiddin Mesbahi for inviting me today, and to Ophelia Curiel and Mohammed Gumrawi for help coordinating all of these logistics. I am glad to see that there are so many attendees, and I'm glad that people care about the plight of the Rohingya, especially at a time when there really is no shortage of racist violence at home or abroad. As we speak, the military coup in Myanmar is taking its toll. As many of you know, mass protests are opposing the coup, and just as the military has ramped up its tactics. It's a reminder, I think, that the well-being of any society can be gauged by how the weakest there lives and survives. And it becomes imperative to recognize that the plight of the Rohingya is not a one-off situation, but one that characterizes the position of the military regime towards minority groups in general in Myanmar. And it's not a one-off situation in a global context either. The military junta in Myanmar has been targeting the Rohingya for over 40 years. In 2017, as you found out, it upped its scale to the point where many, including me and others, consider it genocidal. And at that point, 1 million Rohingyas treaded across treacherous hills, plains, and a river to seek refuge in Bangladesh. So today I will work through Agamben's notion of the state of exception to analyze the plight of the Rohingya. And I'll say this is fruitful for two reasons. First, it gives us a way to understand the state actions and responses to them in a systematic fashion. And second, perhaps more importantly, it shows that the Rohingya crisis is not an anomaly in the world today, but rather a part of a global pattern where temporary removal of rights become lasting peacetime conditions for those who can be rendered exceptional. So the state of exception is the sovereign's declaration of a state of emergency and the suspension of the entire existing order, according to Agamben. He writes that it's an attempt by the state to suspend the law to preserve it. And in doing so, it creates, quote unquote, a no man's land between public law and political fact, and between the juridical order and life, unquote. The parallel drawn to border politics as a way to illustrate how rights are violated holds particularly true for the Rohingya, I'll say, not just figuratively, but literally after they were rendered stateless by the Myanmar government in 1982. And at the heart of the Rohingya crisis, as is probably clear at this point of the panel, is contestation over identity. The Rohingyas have long been termed Kala, or dark, by the Bamar and other ethnic groups. The slur refers not just to the color of their skin, but to their de facto foreign status. The Kalas are from Bengal, and the slur is a shorthand for backward and primitive people, and speaks to how the Rohingya had been racialized. So Dr. De Elena provided a good background here, so I'm not going to go into details, but I'll point out that the way in which the Rohingya were made stateless speaks to what I'd say a classic case of what Agamben calls the state of exception. The state claims an exception and to do something that was until then illegal. Right? In this case, the state rendered the Rohingya stateless, and to claim this exception, the state changed the law. As Agamben writes, quote, "The state of exception appears as the legal form of what cannot have legal form. The law that employs the exception is the suspension of law itself," unquote. So the question is, what meaning does law then have? If exceptions can be claimed so easily as in this case, what meaning does protection under the law have? Right? And armed with Agamben's understanding of how bourgeois states make legal what cannot take legal form, quote unquote, we can look back at the Rohingya activism in the 1980s and question the effectiveness of their approach as well. Their activism centered around their rights, but they also sought to come to terms with this illegal law, and these illegal laws were not challenged. Instead, implicitly, they accepted the state's premise that citizenship could be arbitrarily redefined. So rather than challenging the law, they tried to convince the state that their roots in Myanmar dated back to before 1823, a losing battle for how could poor people with no identity cards, land titles, birth records actually prove their claims. So there is really no way the Rohingya could win against Myanmar's documentation fetish, and they knew that, right? And now we have a protracted crisis with very limited durable solutions in sight. So the first thing to note as we consider the Rohingya situation, I think, in a global context, is the normative effects of the global war on terror. Following 9/11, the US enacted a slew of laws and regulations that violate civil rights, including the US Patriot Act of 2001 and the setting up of detention centers such as in Guantanamo Bay, beyond the purview of US laws, all of which targeted Muslims. Since then, we've seen an export of such kinds of legal practices elsewhere, but more importantly, they have legitimized similar kinds of practices that repressive governments had been using all along, such as indefinite detentions, arrests without cause, and the pretext of national security concerns to profile citizens racially and even strip them of citizenship. Led by the United States, then, the global war on terror legitimizes Islamophobia in the name of counterterrorism all over the world. What that means is that on the ground, in different spaces, political actors used new global norms to inform and legitimize pre-existing bigotry. Thus, what was a conflict between Rakhines and the Rohingya now becomes a conflict between Buddhists and Muslims. Governments from Israel to India to China and Myanmar now clamp down on its Muslim citizens with impunity. Agamben argued that these changes that the US ushered in following 9/11, quote, radically erase any legal status of the individual, thus producing a legally unnameable and unclassifiable being. Not only do the Taliban captured in Afghanistan not enjoy the status of prisoners of war as defined by the Geneva Convention, but they also do not even have the status of persons charged with a crime according to American laws. Neither prisoners nor accused, but simply detainees, they are the object of pure de facto rule of detention that is indefinitely, not only in the temporal sense, but in its very nature as well, since it is entirely removed from the law and from juridical oversight, unquote. So Myanmar's approach to the state of exception in 2017 used a similar logic, but the execution was arguably different, right? The pretext for the military crackdown, their 9/11, if you will, was the coordinated attacks that ARSA took responsibility for against 30 police stations in northern Rakhine. Right? And what we then have is what Agamben would call a modern totalitarianism, defined as the establishment by means of the state of exception of a legal civil war that allowed for the physical elimination not only of political adversaries but of entire categories of citizens for who, for some reason, who cannot be for some reason integrated into the political system. And I want to quickly transition to talking about the political economy, because it's not just the military government interest here at stake. And the timing becomes particularly important then, right? Was the genocide in 2017 Myanmar's way of telling the world how it would operate in this post-liberalization and post-democratization period, having recently just done those, right? A cynical reading would see it as their test of global tolerance. Are the capitalist countries of the world, be it the US, China, or India, be willing to accept the human costs of development, investments, and market access? And this is not merely a rhetorical question to make a point about the lack of international action. If we examine who got the spoils, we see that it is mostly high-ranking generals who appropriated the land, primarily for development purposes, after bulldozing entire villages to remove any sign of habitation in January and February of 2018, soon after the genocide. It is not a coincidence that this fresh set of attacks occurred amidst this new global scramble for Myanmar, I would say, following liberalization and democratization, right, in 2011 and 2012. Countries like India, China, and the US are all involved in this scramble to benefit from an open Myanmar. And they will not support the Rohingya, who can now easily be dismissed as terrorists. So while in an earlier phase, the conflict was a purely domestic one over resource and land, the newer phase has drawn in external interest in the context of market liberalization. Myanmar is the gateway between South Asia and Southeast Asia. China and India both have plans for regional integration, and an open Myanmar gives them access to countries like Thailand and Malaysia and Vietnam and so on. So this is about the potential for developing trade and commerce as well. And to that extent, both China and India have invested significantly in all kinds of things, from deep sea ports to oil pipelines, and not to mention transport projects and just regular FDI. So the political economy of the Rohingya gives us a way to understand why governments utilize the state of exception in the first place. And I'd say Agamben rightly notes that these exceptions have become a dominant paradigm of government in the contemporary period. But why? To what end? And in Myanmar's case, we can recognize the economic impetus behind racially motivated ethnic cleansing and how responding to terrorism gives them an easy pass. And I guess we also recognize that similar kinds of development programs have displaced and marginalized minority groups across the world as well. As we take note of the various signaling by the Myanmar government, I'd like to take a closer look at the military strategy that the Burmese military junta used in August 2017 as well, to sort of connect the economic considerations and the military considerations. And if we look at satellite images obtained by Human Rights Watch, we would see how these attacks took place, right? So anthropologist Belew argues that these strategies were somewhat flawed. Why? Because these images show that the military entered villages from one side, attacked the villagers from that one side, and instead of encircling the village to entrap the people inside and attack from all directions, and closing in from all directions, they actually let them escape. Right? Because they just attacked from one side as the Rohingya fled, right? And Belew argues that most genocidal campaigns actually use this encirclement tactics to wipe out villages. But I'd say, if we sort of pay attention to how this panned out, the military enters from one side, targets the men and kills them, allows the women and children to flee and hide, and then later rape those they could, and then allowing them to flee again. I think the memo kind of reads, kill the men and rape the women, and then let them free. Sorry, I should have put in a trigger warning there. Because this is a little jarring. And two things stand out to me here, and both of them sinister. Right? So first, this strategy is reminiscent of the kind of racism that the Pakistani army officers used to justify rape of Bengali women in 1971. Raping and impregnating women would alter the genetic makeup of the offsprings for generations. Killing the men would prevent the procreation of the Rohingya, an ethnic group that is traditionally endogamous. Razia Sultana's report on sexual violence during this period shows that rape was used as a weapon at different phases of the military operations, during troop buildups, during anti-terror raids, during attacks on villages, during military lockdowns, and as the women tried to flee across mountains. Right? Burmese military officers who was talking to Bangladeshi spokespeople at a Bangladesh-Burma summit that was held later in the year in December in 2017, in an interest to sort of have a dialogue between Burma and Bangladesh as they considered the Rohingya situation. A Burmese military officer said, "We don't kill women and children. We are Buddhists." Right? And that I would say is jarring too, because it clearly showed that rape is clearly not out of bounds, and the military sought to wipe out the Rohingya using rape as a weapon. And as we know, many women and children were also killed, so it's not that they don't kill either. Right? And second, that women and children could flee to Bangladesh may not have been an error on their part. It may well be a calculated choice, right? It may not have had to do with the fact that killing 1 million people overnight posed a challenge to the military, as some may have argued. The military is actually strong enough, as we have seen in past weeks, to have wiped them out without trace, but it chose not to do so, right? Why? And I think we can't really overlook the desired signaling effects here. By allowing witnesses to survive to retell the story of Burmese military might, the military signaled to the Rohingya and other minority groups, now that we think about it, right, including the Rakhine, that that this is the fate of those who resist the state. Right? This is what happens when you resist the state, and to show them the futility of resistance. Right? And this response to terrorism, I think, takes the state of exception to a height that a government probably did not consider, except in the case of Nazi Germany, perhaps. Right? But I also point out that Myanmar's actions are not uniquely reprehensible and disproportional to the crimes committed in light of what happens elsewhere. right? It's nor is it that Agamben's focus on Western democracies means that rights are not violated in Western democracies to the extent of rape and murder, right? What becomes clear is that Agamben is actually interested in domestic constitutional rights. He doesn't really consider the illegal wars that countries wage, such as the US invasion of Iraq following 9/11, right? So the degree to which international wars concern Agamben is premised on how wars provide the context to violate civil rights in the first place. So as in the case of, say, the Japanese Americans who were sent to internment camps in 1942. So the 2017 military operation operated on the idea of the state of exception, but Myanmar isn't really the lone figure here, right? But it does give us a sense of the scale here. And this takes us to Bangladesh's response. So what about Bangladesh's response to the influx of 1 million refugees? And at first glance, Bangladesh's treatment of the Rohingya does not appear to align with the state of exception, right? Because Bangladesh has taken a most humane stance, opening the borders, providing shelter to nearly 1 million refugees overnight, and this role appears particularly impressive in comparison to India, that continues to deport the Rohingya, right?
Dr.
But
Mushid,
I'll also
if you don't
say
mind.
that Bangladesh's position appears humane only because our de facto understanding of refugees is that they have limited rights, even when countries are party to the UN Refugee Convention, right? And states have colluded in the wake of European migration in the post-World War II period to create a framework of limited rights that would be acceptable to all states. Granted, they were operating on the basis that refugees will have no rights, but these limited requirements means that our standards for refugee protection are actually very low. Right? So the state of exception then is not the state's withdrawal of rights using certain pretexts in the case of the refugees. The state of exception characterizes the international refugee regime. Refugee camps, almost by definition, are demarcated zones of exception where local laws do not hold,
Dr.
where
Rashid?
people are enforced encampment without the right to movement, to work, or to even basic necessities beyond what the government and NGOs are willing to provide as benevolent actors, right?
Dr.
And
Mushid.
so, as we
Dr.
think
Mushid.
about this, we would say we should assess Bangladesh's response to the Rohingya crisis, not using these limited notions of protection, by which standard Bangladesh is an outstanding upholder of refugee rights, but using standards we would to assess the rights of citizens. Sorry, I went over time a little bit.
Thank you.
I will end here.
Thank you. Dr. Hussain, please. You have to unmute your mic, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Now is okay?
Yep.
Hi, my name is Mir Hussain. I am the CEO of BASMA. Thank you, everyone. Beautiful discussion. I will give thanks, everyone. I don't want to discuss again the same because everyone already explained and what's going on and what situation was before starting. So I'm just explain the rules of NGO in the Rohingya refugee camp. So as we know, as a 1.3 million Rohingya refugee in Bangladesh right now, and we know as the largest refugee camp in the world, as a big challenge for NGOs like who work inside the camp, refugee camp. So if you go to the next page for me, then I'm going to show. Can you go to the next, please? Next slide. So you see the camp pictures. By the way, I just visited 3 times in camp last 3 years. BASMA working in ground since 2018. So this scene I show you, the over 1.3 million people live like this way. We are like American citizen. We cannot understand without seeing in our own eyes how the situation. So you see the, go to the next page, please. The people is right now in suffering is most of the women and children. So as the NGOs rules, they try how the very small space their life is safe, is health, food, education. So at a Basma, go to the next slide, please. Basma working is a different field. There's a lot of NGOs working over there. Someone is working food security, someone is health, someone is education, someone is water. So Basma is basically working in and over there in food, is health and education. So I don't want to discuss lots of in my slideshow. You can see what kind of work we do. Can you go next, please? So we Basma, a lot of American colleagues we visited. This picture you see, then an American doctors group and professor groups, they visit in Basma, Bangladesh in 2020. So this is like my last visit in Bangladesh. Go to the next. So basically Basma runs currently this kind of project right now: medical care, children education, food aid, orphan care, skill training, winter clothes, clean water. Those are all our running project in camp. Go to the next. So Basma Child Education Center is interesting. It's a lot of children over there. We have a 6 children learning center. So more than 500 children, they are coming in our center and learn their own learning, like Burmese language, not like as a Bangladeshi language. We have a partnership with UNICEF. UNICEF also printed the books for the Burmese language, and we give them clothes, book bags, and some of the healthy meals and tiffin. So this is our learning center. So we have a 6 learning center currently, but as a pandemic time right now, government is not allowed to open the learning center, but we still working in their home. We have our teachers and volunteers. They go to their home and their how they survive. We give the hand sanitizer, mask, and other stuff for COVID situation time. We hope very soon is COVID situation is good and we open again in our lovely learning center. Go to the next, please. So this is our Basma medical post. We have previously we have a 6 medical center. As you know, is very it's a lot of necessary for medical center for. So we provide free medicine, we provide free treatment and counseling, and we have a 6 medical center previously before pandemic. Right now we have only one, Camp 26 Technaf. So more than 100 patients is every day coming, and most of the women and children. So is Rohingya crisis, most of the suffering in the women and children, as we all knows. And also Dr. Murshid saying that a lot of and Mr. John and other also saying this situation. So this medical center is 6 days a week. They came in morning 9 to until 4 o'clock. So we give the free medicine, treatment, other stuff. Go to the next, please. So Orphan Center, we have a small orphan center in camp. So we try to give them care, education. So those orphan center, their father or some mother, they killed the Burmese army in 2017. So this orphan, we care about a small amount of the orphan in camp. We give the education, food, healthcare, and other stuff. Go to the next slide, please. And this is the very interesting program for Basma running in camp, the women skill training program. So what they're doing in camp, think about it. They have no job. They have no any resource. They have no any space to run. So this project is a government approval project. So we try open the skill training for women. Then after 3 months training, then we give the free machine, sewing machine. Then they can run some their necessary clothes they're gonna swinging, and also their neighbor. So this is very good project, and I hope you guys see that Rohingya women is very enjoy this project in camp. So we try in empowering in women for Rohingya as a small way. Go to the next, please. So this is our seasonal project. So we do at the seasonal, some of the project also seasonal, like winter time. We give like 15,000 hoodies for children and also blanket for women and men. So we have a seasonal program every year. We try our best. We feel as a winter time, and in our kids is just take $35, $50 and one jacket or one thing. And Bangladesh cost only $2. So in our South Florida community, I give the thanks, my heart thankful for South Florida community, and they are helping for Basma. We raise the fund for South Florida community. So our fund goes to these innocent people, innocent children. So we proud of that. So Basma, we doing in their contribution, and we using for good cause. Go to the next, please. So this is like Basma impact for 2020. Basma is not only working for Rohingya refugee, Basma also work in Bangladeshi people. You can see Basma, it's a lot of program Basma doing in pandemic time. Basma is a food, then winter cloth and Ramadan seasonal program. So Basma has a lot of program in the camp and also Bangladeshi people. So go to the next, please. So problems, as an NGO, I telling you how many problems we can solve. It's a lot of problems. So internationally, just everyone is just talk, but they not take action. So I humbly appeal to all of us, all of you, we need work. We need work more than talk. So then is problem can be solved, and we need try in our heart, not like as a fake. Most of the time, we just like look like as I see the movie. Because why I'm telling that? Because I visit 3 times, I feel my heart how the situation over there. Someone who not visit the camp, they don't understand how's going on over there. So that's why I'm saying we need to take action for internationally. Not too much talk. We need to take action. Go to the next, please. So how the solution? The solution is in diplomatic solution. So as internationally is a big country, or UN or USA is not help the Bangladesh government, this problem cannot be solved. Bangladesh cannot, their own resource can solve this problem. I give the thanks, special thanks for Bangladesh government. So they take care of 1.3 million people. Can you think about it? How many refugees we take care and as a USA? How many refugees? So Bangladesh, I'm going to give you a thankful heart for Bangladesh government, but we need help the Bangladesh government so this problem solved as soon as possible. And as this kind of dialogue, as a help to more speak up to this kind of situation, then how many faster is to solve this problem. Go to the next, please. So the basically is I'm not like a big speaker. You guys already knows the all situation, all happened. So as I am shared the experience and what I see in the camp, what we need in the camp. And I humbly all of you requested. So please let's go work together and we try. This is the human. They have a rights to life. They have a children have a right to learn. Everybody need to, they have rights. So we need to speak up. We need hard work to solve this problem as soon as possible. I will humbly request all of you, please speak up and work together. Then I am so sorry to my broken English. I think you guys understand. If you not understand, let me know. I can write down. And if you need more about Basma, you can go www.basma.org and also our Facebook page. If you have any question, you can write our email and anything. So I hope I'm okay. So thank you so much and bringing me this panel. So if you have any question, I can get answer.
Thank you. Thank you very much. By the way, if you could keep the screen up, and those of you in the audience, if you can take your camera phones and take a photograph, so you can have the contact information, that would be great. Before you can ask questions, you have a Q&A box. Please, if you have any questions for the panelists, go ahead and write them and we'll make sure that the panelists get the questions. Before that, I go on. I want to thank you, other people, other groups have sponsored this project, this panel discussion. I want to thank the Jaffer Institute for Interfaith Dialogue and Education in Miami-Dade College. Also the Coalition of South Florida Muslim Organizations, Cosmos, the Islamic Center of Greater Miami, the Islamic School of Miami, and again, the Bangladesh American Society of Muslim Aid for Humanity. Thank you. I want to make sure you got recognized. Thank you so much for sponsoring, co-sponsoring this panel discussion. All right, if you have any questions, please write them in your Q&A box and the panelists will respond to them. Okay, excellent. Give generously, David Skip, my colleague, says. All right, any questions, please write them in the Q&A chat. Let me begin, if I may, with a question for the panelists while the audience is warming up. President Biden, I believe, made some comments, very strong comments about the coup in Myanmar. Has the Biden administration, to your knowledge, and this goes to all of you, made any serious efforts to address the crisis of the Rohingya in Myanmar, apart from the coup d'etat?
I'll take this if no one else wants to talk about it. So the only thing that Biden has commented on is about the coup, right? Which kind of proves what everyone's issues with our American politics system is, right? That, there's been this madness going on for so many years against the Rohingya and nobody makes a move on the American side, as a matter of fact. And, and I say this hurtfully because I am a Democrat, right? And unfortunately, my party has failed to do anything in favor of the Rohingya. In 2000, I hope it's 2015, but I'm not sure if it was 2014 or 15. Obama lifted a bunch of sanctions that should have stayed. And he tried to make more amicable connections with Myanmar, and and then in 2017, all this that we just spoke about happened. So I mean, it's very concerning that their concern is for the Buddhist majority, and perhaps Aung San Suu Kyi and her followers and their agenda, and not the Rohingya. As in terms of the Rohingya, they did condemn it for the first time recently, but there has been no action taken.
please, the audience, we have a substantial number of people watching this, and please don't hesitate to ask questions of the panelists. I have one more question, Dr. Murshid and for Dr. Oates. We've seen the rise of nationalism, right, in India, the PJP, an attitude towards the Muslims in India that they don't belong in India. India's for the Hindus. Is this kind of the same phenomenon developing in Myanmar towards the Rohingya, the kind of nationalism? Myanmar is for the Buddhists and not for the Muslims?
I can go first. I think in a way it's the other way around, right? That currently in India, what's being talked about and frowned upon is the Citizenship Amendment Act of 2019 that got passed, and that's effectively saying that those in India from Muslim majority countries, or primarily, I guess, Bangladesh and Pakistan. So non-Muslim immigrants are refugees, whereas Muslim ones are infiltrators and or illegal immigrants, quote unquote. What we are seeing in India, I think, is an attempt to actually do to certain segments of the Muslim population what has been done to the Rohingya already through changing the law and institutionalizing racism such a way that it essentially takes away citizenship rights from a segment of the population, the Muslim population, right? So this becomes particularly concerning in a context where India has a large Bengali Muslim population, and they are the ones who are targeted as being undocumented Bangladeshis, similar to the Rohingya, right? So in that way, this happened first in Myanmar, right? That they identify the Rohingya as Bangladeshis, as foreign, and so on. We've seen this sort of rhetorically on the ground in India for a very long time, also, but it's now in this period that we are seeing I think a similar kind of move where laws are being changed in order to render a certain group, a minority group, stateless. So there is certainly that connection, right? But you're right in saying that India has a very long history of what they call communal tensions, by which we basically mean tensions between the Hindu and Muslim populations, and Islamophobia has become very, very common in this period with the rise of the Hindu right, and supported by the Islamophobia produced by the war on terror. So all of these things conflate together to legitimize Islamophobia across the region, I think. And so I think to sort of recognize that we only need to see how easily we think of Muslims when we think of terrorism, right, in the region too. And I think it's important to also note that in this period, I guess this is how norms work, I suppose, right? That even in Bangladesh we sort of see this kind of conflation being used, that terrorists are code word for Islamists, or Islamists are code word for terrorists, and using this kind of justification to essentially remove rights, right? Which is why I think using Agambin's notion of the state of exception is useful, because he's concerned with the sort of removal of rights using a particular pretext, but then it's also limited, right? Because we are talking about not just civil rights here.
Right. Dr. Oates, you want to address this? I have a couple of more questions. You want to address it, Dr. Oates?
I would just add that these developments are really sort of demonstrating the weakness of international regimes related to statelessness. There are treaties out there where They ask governments to commit to not allowing groups within their territory to be stateless, but many states have not signed on to it. Asia in particular, very few signatories. Nobody in South Asia or Southeast Asia has signed on to these relevant treaties. And I think that kind of, those norms then have sort of weakened over time because you don't have a broad commitment to them, and which opens the door to these kinds of politics that you're seeing. And so this crisis, I think, should prompt us to rethink sort of the importance of these norms, the importance of those treaties, and think about how to reinvigorate that discussion about the need to address the problem of statelessness, which I do see some of that in the discussion, but it's, I think, a long-term response that requires sort of more commitment on the part of key states and the international community.
Thank you. There's a question from, I'm sorry, go ahead, Dr.
I'm just going to abuse my presence here, although I'm not part of the panel. I'm just a student here. I think that theoretically is very critical, and also connecting the theoretical explanation to what is going on the ground. This is what I do in my seminar on strategic and security studies. The idea that the war on terror was not just a physical activity, is fundamentally first a normative structure. And therefore there is a fundamental ontological connection between intersubjective framing of the Muslims everywhere as a security threat, outside and inside the states. So that comes, and then it comes military interventionism by violating international law, violating international organizations' perspective. So the destructions of international law concerns or importance took place significantly by the Western countries since 2001, specifically. But we can even go further back to see how anti-Muslim rhetoric and intersubjective socialization of Islam as a threat in post-Cold War led to genocidal attempts in Bosnia. It was exactly the same thing. Putin of Russia used it in Chechnya. And I think the Chinese government's contemplating maybe to use the same sort of a permissiveness to deal with their Muslims in Xinjiang. So it's a global phenomenon. And of course, India, which is the most explosive case of making 250 million Muslims as second-class citizens and so on. Therefore, this case is an embodiment of a fundamental shift in conversations about rights. You cannot be selective about rights. And I think the Western world in post 9/11 basically practically made this possible. And everybody is tapping into it. And therefore this effort by purely international organizations or legal remedies cannot escape the impact, which is completely systemic. And that is why the change of US policy on war on terror is major contextual factor. And then from that, they have to change their rhetoric. Unfortunately, they're going to apply this selectively as they have done it. Now they're going to go after China, specifically on Xinjiang, because geopolitically it's conducive. And Burma, maybe because Burma is pro-China, whatever, but not anywhere else. Therefore, this selectivity about international law, rights, even allows people who are winners of the human rights Nobel Prize to just get silent and go along with it. Sure. And therefore the society gets involved. I mean, the Burma society, like the German society, which committed crime against the Jewish population, is complicit in this. So we're talking about the genocidal attempt and only governments involved, but sections of society is getting involved because that's permissive now internationally. So I think this opens the door for a significant theoretical and academic discussions, and then the cases are coming and emerging next to each other. So I think Bangladesh is, I mean, this case is not exception, it's a continuation of the post-1990s, I would say post-Cold War, overall securitization of Muslims as an archetype, no matter where they are. And the result of the policy is coming out of that. And governments all over the world are tapping into it in the way they know. And until the US changes its policy, UN cannot do anything about it. International law would not be effective because there is a fundamental connection between geopolitical balance of power and geosocial structures of international relations. And therefore, as Naveen says, there is definitely an economic structure, political economy attached to it. All three is working together, and great powers play a significant role in shifting it this way or that way. In other words, there is a connection, as Naveen says, between people who are ending in Guantanamo for 20 years, but nobody knows why, and what happens to Rohingya. And they're nobodies. Both of them are nobodies. They are out of the international law, therefore a state of exception made it possible to become non-person, practically. And I think this is a global problem, and therefore the Rohingyan case is a manifestation of a profoundly difficult problem in international politics, especially, but not exclusively, since 9/11. Thank you. This is just an intervention. I think Gursel or Naveen or John can respond to me until you have questions from
there's a question here. Our colleague, Dr. Oren Steer, has written, coincidentally, today's Yom HaShoah, Israel Holocaust Memorial Day, and one parallel that comes to mind is the legalized delegitimization of a very small minority in a sovereign nation. Given the challenges of confronting a nation state's own decisions concerning citizenship from outside, for example, what can other governments really do about the plight of the Rohingya?
I can definitely, I can contribute to this. I would love to hear what my colleagues or the panelists have to say about this. But I think the refugees that are in need of resettlement still significantly exceed the number of locations that are available for them to be resettled into, right? So in my opinion, more affluent states and the international community as a whole have failed to share responsibility for providing for the needs of the refugees globally. In the present moment, low and middle income countries bear the larger part of the responsibility, like Bangladesh, and to provide shelter to the refugees, and it's just not enough. I think wealthier countries are not doing enough to share the financial burden for the global refugee crisis, and it is fundamental for them to take action in order for this to be resolved, because the UN can only offer, and the UNHCR can only offer, emergency aid.
Well, we have 3 minutes left, and I really want Dr. Murshid, Joan, and Hussein, if you have any comments on this. I have one more question here. From Natalia Oliveiro, how can interreligious dialogue play a role to help the Rakhine Buddhists accept the Rohingya Muslims back in Myanmar? We all think of the Buddhists as being, loving and accepting, and all of a sudden it's gone here. Does interreligious dialogue, can it play a constructive role in healing the breach between these two communities?
I have one question answer. I need to, one of the people asked me the one question, so I want to give an answer.
Sure.
Yes, one of the brother, he asking, is my experience as a Rohingya refugee, they like to stay in Bangladesh or they want to go back in Burma? Absolutely. My 3 times I visit in Bangladesh, I ask a lot of family. So they don't want to stay in Bangladesh and refugee camp. They want to back. In international community ensure they are safe in Burma. They have no problem, so they're ready to go. They don't want to stay in Bangladesh. And who wants to stay in third country? Because is the 5 by 5 feet and bamboo house and top of the plastic triple, and this house, who wants to stay long time in this kind of home? No life, no future. So I ask a lot of families when I'm my visiting time. So everybody wants to go back, but they want to security. If they find is a 100% security place, they can back. But Unfortunately, international political pressure is not Myanmar government. So we hope everyone try to hard work and work together. So pressure the government to return all these people. Thank you so much.
Well, our time is up. I want to thank the panelists, Grisel Olido, my colleague, Dr. Oates, my colleague as well, Naveen Murshid from Colgate University, and Mir Hussain from the Bangladesh group. Thank you so very much for being a participant. The event of today is concluded, and please don't forget to attend to the message, right, that Mir Hussain put up, the contact information to make a contribution and make things happen. Thank you very much. The event is concluded. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, John. John,
Thank you.
very much. I appreciate that. I know you'll be busy.
It was fun.
I drag you into